B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, August 26, 2019. Today, I get to use some of my high school French. Because in a surprise ending to the G7 summit in Biarritz, France, Emmanuel Macron, he says Trump knew about it, but he trotted out a guest who was not initially invited. And that would be the foreign minister of the nation of Iran, Javad Zarif. Now, I don't like everything Emmanuel Macron does. He's the equivalent of a corporatist, and his alleged attempts to reform labor rules in France, in particular, draw my ire. But he has been single-minded and willing to debase himself. I referred recently to his trip to Washington in it was the spring, April of 2017, and he was kissing Trump's ass in such an embarrassing and obsequious way that it drew our attention. And his goal was to keep Trump from bailing on the six-nation accord with Iran, which is casually referred to as the Iranian nuclear deal. Now, Macron did not win at that time, and Trump, at the prodding of John Bolton and others, including Benjamin Netanyahu, went forward with the ridiculous plan to withdraw from that agreement, and then to build on that with new sanctions, trying to isolate Iran, trying to provoke a military conflict. We've seen that play out over the last few months. So I got to give Macron credit. He apparently on Saturday at dinner said, "Hey, Don, you mind if Zarif drops by tomorrow?" And Trump said, "Well, I don't want to meet with him, but it is okay for you to bring him into the meeting." And so this opens the door to what the French call rapprochement. And rapprochement is a term that refers to the reestablishment of cordial relations between two countries. Now, we're at the early stages here. I don't want to invest heavily in this or set any great expectations. But hey, Trump has agreed in general to a face-to-face meeting with the leader of Iran, President Rouhani. We'll get Rouhani's reaction in a moment. But I would much rather see talks about talks than John Bolton's talk about military action against the nation of Iran. So the G7 didn't accomplish much else. They agreed on a paltry $20 million to fight the fires in the Amazon. Trump skipped out of that meeting and then declared that he's an environmentalist, and we just don't know it. But the real takeaway is the prospect of renewed talks between the U.S. and Iran. And while Trump dispenses with so many standards of diplomacy and protocol and international order, because his ego and his narcissistic needs are so great, he revels in this opportunity to be the guy who can make the deal that nobody thought was possible. So, I certainly have no objection to a meeting with Hassan Rouhani. My only concern is that Iran has had to shift its position. They had said, we don't have anything to negotiate about. We did that with the six nations, and the U.S. decided to opt out. But the sanctions and the threat of a military confrontation appear to have changed the calculus in Tehran. So Rouhani said Iran would use both diplomacy and power to stand up to the United States and achieve its goals. Iran would resist its enemies when it benefits us, but also appeared to admonish domestic critics of diplomacy, saying that both approaches were necessary. Those who think that only one of these instruments is enough are wrong. He said Iran needs to use its military, security, cultural, and political powers to stand up to the United States. Now, you have to understand that Rouhani does not run Iran. Everything revolves around the Ayatollah. And he is viewed as a moderate in Iran, which leaves the hardliners, the military, the mullahs, with a great deal of power. And so his ability to deliver in a one-on-one meeting with Trump is probably limited compared to, say, Kim Jong-un or Xi Jinping or even the dreaded Vladimir Putin. So we'll see where all this goes. But I was surprised at these developments, and again, I give Macron credit for trying. While he was in France, Trump continued to tweet and claimed the expansive powers to order American companies to end their trade and commerce with China. And he claims that under a 1977 law that you and I have never heard of before, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 77, a law originally meant to enable a president to isolate criminal regimes, not sever economic ties with a major trading partner over a tariff dispute. And the New York Times trots out Dan Price, former international economic advisor to George W. Bush. Any invocation of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act in these circumstances and for these purposes would be an abuse. The act is intended to address extraordinary national security threats and true national emergencies, not fits of presidential pique. So, late yesterday, Trump indicated that China had called. You know, these are vague and unsubstantiated claims. But he said they're ready to talk again. And the stock market is up 1% after shedding, 4% total last week, something like that. And so we live and die on the aspirations provided by Trump's tweets once again. Well, there is some energy in the Republican Party to challenge the Trumpster in 2020. And it's coming from a guy who's almost as unhinged as he is. Joe Walsh is the former one-term congressman from Illinois, a Tea Party stalwart, who now is running a radio talk show. That sound familiar? Well, here's a guy who's done his own crackpot stuff. He has a history of making inflammatory statements regarding Muslims. He declared just before the 2016 election that if Trump lost, quote, "I'm grabbing my musket." Wow. So he went on this week on ABC and said somebody needs to step up and there needs to be an alternative. The country is sick of this guy's tantrum. He's a child. He lies every time he opens his mouth. Now, this is the second defection in recent weeks as Anthony Scaramucci, the Mooch, what was he, communications director at the White House for 11, maybe 10 days? Well, he called out Trump for fat-shaming one of the fans at a recent mob rally for being fat. And the Mooch on Twitter said, you know, he's fat. Or a fathead. I don't even know what the tweet was, but it caused Twitter to suspend the Mooch's account for 12 hours. That'll show him. So we've got Joe Walsh, not the great guitarist who went on to join the Eagles, but the loudmouth former congressman from Illinois. And he's trying to recruit Kellyanne Conway's husband. Now, George T. Conway III is a guy who's got a healthy Twitter following. It's not the 60 million that Trump has. But he tweets criticism of the president to the chagrin of his blonde wife, who is out there spinning for the president on a regular basis. And there's been a lot of fun speculation about what it's like at their breakfast or dinner table. I won't go into the bedroom with Kellyanne and George, but, there are a lot of people who find this a little bizarre, if not somewhat amusing. So you've got Joe Walsh trying to woo George Conway to join his campaign against Trump. And, of course, Trump has this lockdown of the Republican voter base, like 80% will vote for him no matter what happens or who else runs. So it is a bit of folly. But to the extent that Walsh will wound Trump or damage his support among Republicans, we have to say, come on down, Joe. See what you can do. New polls coming out show that Joe Biden is losing his grip on front-runner status. And this is something that I expected. I don't make a lot of predictions, but when Joe Biden formally announced for president, I did predict that by fall that he would not be the leader and that he will bow out. I still think this sometime before the caucuses and primaries get underway early next year. The new Monmouth University poll shows Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Uncle Joe Biden each pulling 20% of Democratic voters. Oh, wait a minute. I erred. It's Sanders and Warren with 20, and Biden has dropped to 19. Now, these are statistically a tie. But with no other candidate even getting into double digits, it shows that the race is tightening, that the progressives, Sanders and Warren, are the ones who are generating excitement and building a strong base of primary voters. And Biden's hope is that he can just stand there and be moderate and refer to Obama, try not to utter another gaffe, and hope that his name ID and the desire to win at all costs, including putting up an uninspiring retread like Joe Biden, I think that people are recognizing that there's not a lot of growth opportunity for Biden, and that he is not the guy who can carry the Democrats to victory against the stable genius in the White House. Seth Moulton of Massachusetts, who had tried to hog the middle of the road in the Democratic primaries, he's given up, and rightly so. He doesn't have any traction. And he did, of course, take shots at the progressives on his way out of the race. He warned that if Democrats were to embrace an overly liberal platform, it could make it harder to defeat Trump. Quote, I think it's evident that this is now a three-way race between Biden, Warren, and Sanders, and really it's a debate about how far left the party should go. And he has, in my view, exactly the wrong advice. We hear all these claims from the so-called moderates, and, you know, they put the senator from Colorado, and I can see his face right now, and it's embarrassing. I'm blocking on his name. Michael Bennet, yes. They made him, in one of the debates, the attack dog, where John Delaney, the obscure former congressman from Maryland, was the attack dog in the other panel. And their whole message, which, of course, is embraced by the corporate media, is that people promoting Medicare for all, an end to regime change wars, and a reorientation of the economy to the middle class, they can't possibly get elected against Trump. And I believe the exact opposite, that if you don't offer people real proposals to address their chronic issues, chronic problems, that the Democrats will just not excite voters, turnout will be low, and Trump will once again prevail at the Electoral College. So I hope that people come to their senses and understand that what campaigns are about is presenting shiny goals that people can relate to and say, yes, I want to get there to Medicare for all. And we all know, if we're honest, that if Bernie Sanders is elected, it will be a very heavy lift to pass Medicare for all. Democrats have to hold the House and even turn it more progressive than it is today. And they have to repopulate the Senate in ways that are even hard to imagine right now, given the political divide and the power that the right wing enjoys in this country today. And unless the Democrats offer a clear contrast, this is why I was so disappointed by the DNC meeting in San Francisco refusing to authorize a sanctioned presidential candidate debate about climate change. They missed opportunities. They pissed off key voter segments. And when we look back 20 years from now, and the sea level has risen by 3 feet, we're going to say, wow, that meeting in Frisco, that sure was a blunder on the part of the Democrats. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like, I think I mentioned them the other day. Let me jump down the list here. I haven't talked about Joey Perillo in Philly for a while, Wendy Bauer, Faith Peoples, and Diane Morse-Leonard. I appreciate each and every one of you for supporting my work, and I invite those who never hear their names called here to fix that. All you got to do is drop into peterbcollins.com. There's a menu tab, no matter what device you use. Touch on that, then pull down on Become a Subscriber. You'll hit the sign-up page, and in minutes, you can be out the door with a nice subscription to the Peter B. Collins Podcast. And if you take out a new annual $50 subscription, send me a mailing address in the continental U.S., I've got bonus books for you. 2100, A Dystopian Utopia, The Blueprints for Surviving Climate Change. And Dr. Justin A. Frank's analysis of the Trump psyche. It's called Trump on the Couch. I'd love to send you a bonus book. Well, while we're talking about the Democrats, I want to refer you to a really sharp, critical commentary published today by Ken Freeland over at Mint Press News. And Ken is affiliated with the Pacifica radio stations, and his take on this is from a leftist perspective. It's about foreign policy, and he does not give any quarter to any of the candidates. So, for example, he takes on Elizabeth Warren. She said early on she hopped on the Sanders Medicare for All train. Perhaps this was mere political opportunism on her part. But some suspect that she has the tacit support of the DNC to take the wind out of Sanders' sails, after which she will herself be summarily jettisoned unless the preferred corporatist candidates prove unviable. He touches briefly on Marianne Williamson and declares her, at heart, a Zionist who has spent many a sojourn in the Promised Land, and that she really doesn't talk much about foreign policy. And when she does, the only bright spot is her bold anti-interventionist line supporting self-determination for the people of Venezuela, and I support that as well. In looking at Bernie Sanders, he opens by taking down the Sanders position on Venezuela, because while Bernie doesn't support military intervention, he appears to support the regime change goal and embrace the claim of phony or faulty elections in Venezuela, which isn't true. Moreover, says Ken, he also intones ad nauseum the Democratic Party Russiagate claptrap from start to finish. And that is worthwhile criticism. But Sanders is the only candidate who's ever suggested that U.S. aid to Israel might need to be reconsidered. Then he shifts to Tulsi Gabbard, says that I admit once having been smitten by her seeming earnestness in opposing U.S. wars, until she slavishly voted in favor of the anti-BDS resolution. That was in July. Then he took a deeper dive into her record, and she said that I discovered to my horror that Tulsi is most likely a hawk in dove's clothing. First of all, she says she's an ardent supporter of Israel. Anyone with any doubt should watch her stomach-churning speech at the Christians United for Israel conference in 2015. He goes on to note, when Gabbard says she is a hawk in the war on terror, she is a true believer. She is as clueless that 9/11 was a false flag operation to launch that murderous juggernaut as she is that the various permutations of Islamic terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda are just so many creatures of the deep state. And when she says she's on a mission, we would do well to take Major Gabbard literally, that she considers the regime change wars a hindrance to her mission, demonstrates either abject stupidity or, to be more charitable, extreme political naivete. Finally, he says, Ken Freeland, about her, Gabbard, it's a serious error to view her as an anti-interventionist or anti-militarist in principle. She is neither. That she opposes regime change wars as inimical to her military objective is true enough, but for all intents and purposes, that puts her in the position of deluded denizens of Plato's allegorical cave. And then he takes a look at Andrew Yang, who actually supports the Guaido rump government in Venezuela and doesn't have a terribly well-articulated foreign policy suite of views overall. So I think it's a worthwhile read. I don't agree with everything Freeland says. I don't expect you to either, but I hope it provokes thoughtful criticism on your part of the candidates who you may end up voting for. I want to commend Russ Baker. He's the editor-in-chief at whowhatwhy.org. And as you know, I produce podcasts that have a first run at Who, What, Why. And Russ has an editorial that he wrote regarding those of us who have questions, doubts about the official narrative that Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide in his jail cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York. And Baker notes that establishment media usually ignore or ridicule non-traditional media when the latter ask questions that don't conform to a pro-system bias. And they have a tougher time when it is one of their own breaking ranks. So the Washington Post reporter Carol Leonig, she tweeted, "People close to Epstein fear he was murdered. As Epstein told authorities, someone tried to kill him in a previous incident weeks earlier. He was described as being in good spirits in recent days." So, says Baker, in a rare display, we saw other major news organizations take the Post to task. For instance, Rolling Stone quoted Tim Gleason, a professor of journalism at Oregon. "I don't know why she would have tweeted this. What was she thinking? It's hard not to read that and think she is suggesting something else happened." Well, Baker says the thing is, many people find the suicide scenario suspicious. Of course, quite a few powerful people would potentially be at risk if Epstein were to tell all he knew. Plus, a highly unusual set of circumstances in the jail had to dovetail for possible harm to come to Epstein while he's locked up, which is why recent polls show that only 29% of the American public believes it was a suicide. So I commend Russ Baker for maintaining a skeptical approach, looking for the evidence. It mirrors my own. Then we have the case of the Epstein investigation being run by the Justice Department. And Bill Barr, the Attorney General, had said upon the recent rearrest of Epstein that he was completely recusing himself because his father had hired Jeffrey Epstein as a math teacher. I think it was the Dalton School. It's some prestigious private school in Manhattan. But as soon as the reported suicide, Bill Barr has got all of his pudgy fingers all over this. Barr is scrambling for answers, and the Times warns that as he is doing so, unfounded conspiracy theories have taken root, casting an additional pall over the matter. But I don't see any mention here of the previous public recusal of Bill Barr from the Epstein case. It would be inconvenient. Wouldn't it be impolite to raise that now? Prosecutors in France have opened an investigation into what Epstein may have done with underage females on their soil. And meanwhile, I want to highly recommend that you read Part 4, and if you haven't read the other 3 installments, the entire series of Whitney Webb's reporting on Jeffrey Epstein. Late Friday, they published at Mint Press News the 4th installment. There will be additional stories, they promise. And this one is focused on the connections between Bill Clinton and Jeffrey Epstein. They go back to when Clinton was president, actually even before that, the 1980s, the Contra base, the resupply base in Arkansas at the Mena Airport, the role of Southern Air Transport. And I learned quite a bit from this 4th installment when I read it on Friday night. because Jeff Epstein and his, I don't know quite how to describe his role with Les Wexner, but Wexner is this billionaire based in Columbus, Ohio, and Epstein had control of his fortune. We know that. Well, when Bill Clinton became president, Les Wexner bought Southern Air Transport. It was the airline that was a front for the CIA that was used to transport weapons to Central America and bring cocaine back. Other aircraft were used as well. But that so-called airline was purchased by Wexner and moved to Columbus, Ohio in the early 1990s. And I didn't know that. Also, Epstein is connected to the Bank of Commerce and Credit International, BCCI, which was used to fund a lot of arms trafficking in the 1980s. It went belly up in the early 90s, and that's a scandal I've covered before. So there's quite a bit in here. For example, that Epstein was a financial advisor to the international weapons trader Adnan Khashoggi, the uncle of the Khashoggi who brutally was snuffed out by the Saudis last year. Khashoggi and other arms dealers were Epstein clients. Epstein claimed he was a bounty hunter for wealthy people, and he had a concealed carry permit. And Whitney Webb concludes that while it's unlikely that the CIA considered Jeffrey Epstein a direct agent or asset, that he was working in intelligence circles, including the CIA and the Mossad. The Mark Rich pardon, done at the last minute by Bill Clinton before he left office, is attributed to the influence of Epstein and other members of the ultra-powerful Jewish international mega group. Epstein donated to a Clinton charity in 1993 and is described as part of the group that conceived the Clinton Global Initiative, a major shakedown, in my view, that gave the Clintons a whole pool of money to work with and to further their influence worldwide. Jason Leopold is back reporting on the way I like to see it over at BuzzFeed News. He got the federal government and a federal judge to release documents related to Felix Sater. And Sater is this guy who worked for Trump, but we now know that he was an asset, a government snitch, because he ran into trouble and he acted for years as a secret asset of the U.S. government, provided intelligence that included Osama bin Laden's whereabouts, the internal structuring financial capabilities of al-Qaeda, the whereabouts of the Taliban leader Mullah Omar, ground reports on who was killed by U.S. airstrikes, and other information that you've got to scratch your head and say, well, this guy was peddling Trump's condos and laundering money for Russians who bought them. So how does that make him, how did it give him an entree into the world of bin Laden and al-Qaeda? I can't answer that. But the disclosures now from the government say that when Sater went undercover was instrumental in weakening the mafia's presence on Wall Street. He played a, quote, crucial role in helping the U.S. government dismantle money laundering operations in Russia, Cyprus, Turkey, and elsewhere. And BuzzFeed quotes Sater as being happy that this has been disclosed. He said, given the events of the last 3 years, I'm happy that people can now judge me for the bad that I've done and the good that I've done. I just hope that 20 years of service to protect America adds a little to the plus column. Well, you didn't get indicted, Felix. I think your magic is working. Want to recommend a great piece by Scott Ritter, the former UN weapons inspector, publishing yesterday, no, it's actually today, at the American Conservative. And he takes on the American media accounts of the recent alleged nuclear accident at the Russian naval test site, which is on the White Sea in northern Russia. And he basically says that what you read in the American media is a lot of bullshit. And he breaks it down in some technical detail here of what the reports indicate for him. Essentially, they were testing a temperature stabilizer that requires modest electrical power. If that power is interrupted, then the thermometer doesn't work and the mixture of elements can take place. And he believes that's what led to the explosion that immediately killed 4 men and has taken 7 lives in total. He says the reality of what happened at Nanuxa was tragic. 7 men lost their lives, scores of others injured, but there was no explosion of a nuclear cruise missile, and it wasn't the second coming of Chernobyl. Israel is bombing its neighbors with impunity. First, they have repeatedly bombed in Syria, then a recent incident in Iraq, and over the weekend they sent drones into Lebanon for an attack in Beirut that's described as the first hostile action by Israel since the 2006 war. I agree with Mehdi Hassan, publishing at The Intercept today, that Aung San Suu Kyi, who is the nominal leader of Myanmar, should be indicted for genocide against the Rohingya. It has now been 2 years since nearly 750,000 people were driven from their homes among rape and pillaging of their villages. They are camped out in neighboring Bangladesh, and as we reported last week, the moves by Myanmar to repatriate them are just for show. And the fact that she won the Nobel Peace Prize does not change my view of her role in this genocidal or ethnic cleansing operation. And finally, today I want to recommend Nicholas Kristof's column in the Sunday New York Times. He continues his crusade to end the war on some drugs. He focuses on programs in Seattle where instead of arresting needle drug users, the cops take them to a rehab clinic and try to get them into a program. And I can't really do justice. It's a pretty long piece, but I certainly agree with Mr. Kristof that we're not going to win this war based on prohibition. That much is very clear. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. Please share it all over the damn place. You'll find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.